Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Will Tarashuk. I am the founder of Ambiguous Podcast Solutions. This is the beginning of the APS Introduction to a Podcast series, where myself, the founder, Will Tarashuk, as well as all of the APS partners, including Christian Wright, the founder of Cube Recording Studios, of this beautiful studio that I am in currently, as well as Jared Laverne, our CEO, and Nash Moore, who is the Director of Operations. We'll be pretty much introducing you to the world of podcasting, anything from how to get started, what the idea is, how to edit video, how to market, how to distribute podcasts, pretty much the A to Z of podcasting. We're going to start and run it down right here. You're going to see a lot of my face, so get used to it. Christian, man behind the board, I could not do this without you. My friend, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Happy to break down all things logistically on the side of how to make a podcast and what that entails, as well as the more technical audio-oriented side, which, as Will said, you'll be seeing a lot of his face for some of those things. You'll be seeing a lot of my face for some of those things.
Yeah, I'm mainly a lot of like the creative side. I'm the ideas guy, and someone like Christian is the tech guy. Where this microphone, he can give you in-depth explanations of why this microphone does what it does. This kind of arm extender as opposed to this desk stand that is sitting under me. Different types of equipment to use, recording software. That's kind of more his expertise. Whereas me, it's just like, here's how I came with my ideas for my podcast. So speaking of podcasts, my introduction to podcasts was, honestly, I wanted to stand out on a resume. That is why I started my podcast. But a few months back prior to, actually a few years prior to that, I started listening to podcasts back in high school, which was probably about late 2012, early 2013, mainly because I was looking for something different. At that time, I kind of phased out of music. I didn't listen to my iPod in months. But then I found a podcast through a YouTube channel, the Schmoes No Movie Show. So shout out to Kristen Harloff and Mark Ellis. You guys are my heroes. And I found their podcast on iTunes. And from there, I found a wrestling podcast, so I still listen to this day. I found Joe Rogan, who maintains to be a huge influence on me. And then in college, sophomore year, I started my own first wrestling podcast, the King's Rings podcast, which, as of recording this, 311 episodes later, is still going strong. And I really started podcasting to stand out on a resume. And I can't think of one job interview I've had where they didn't ask me about my podcast. Even as I applied for a bartender, they asked me about my podcast. So podcasting is just ingrained in my life. I listen to podcasts more than I listen to music. I listen to podcasts while I do everything. I listen to podcasts while I'm cooking. I listen to podcasts when I'm in the shower. I listen to podcasts on the ride over here. I listen to podcasts when I'm playing video games. I listen to podcasts while I do everything. When I'm editing podcasts, I'm listening to my own podcast. So podcasting is ingrained in my life, and this company, Ambiguous Podcast Solutions, also kind of came out of necessity. So you're going to get a lot of my passion in all of my podcasts, just as well as throughout this series. So hold your tears back, please. But let's answer the question. What is a podcast? In the most basic sense, a podcast is just internet radio. It's an audio blog that's hosted on an RSS feed. Now, an RSS feed, we'll get into the technicals of that in a little bit, but I also call podcasts, it's the number one form of secondary entertainment, meaning you don't find many people who just kind of sit in an empty room and listen to a podcast. I'm sure they're out there, but podcasts are done while you're doing something else. Like I said, on the ride over here, I was driving, listening to a podcast, cooking dinner, listening to a podcast. Anywhere else, anywhere you would normally listen to music, that is where you can listen to a podcast. The most common place people listen to podcasts is on the commute to work. On the bus, before I hop on the bus to go into work, listen to a podcast. And in 2021, 116 million Americans listen to a podcast monthly. And that's up from 67 million in 2017. So podcasting is an ever growing industry. So I'm glad you are interested. I'm glad you have a passion for it. And it's still emerging. Podcasting has been around since 2004, but it's still kind of in its infancy. I started in 2015, and things are way different now than they were then. But also podcasts, this is an easy way to remember what a podcast is. A podcast is a personally or professionally oriented discussion centered around select topics. Now, that is a Will Tarashuk original. That is something I came up with all by myself because I am a big boy. That's the podcast acronym. If someone ever asks you what a podcast is, It is a personal or professionally oriented discussion centered around select topics. And the P is the most important part of that acronym. The P stands for personal or professional. And that's really where I kind of got to draw a line down the middle for this whole series, where some of the advice, tips, and tricks I give are going to apply to a personal podcast, meaning you're an individual. It's a hobby. You try to make some extra cash off Patreon or YouTube's ads or what have you. Or it's professional, where you're a business trying to get lead gen, marketing, sell a product, promote your product. It's very more, professional, for lack of a better word. Then oriented discussion, it's something orient means you're centered around. You're centered around a discussion and also centered around select topics, meaning you're talking about a specific topic or topics. The plural in the topics is also very, very important, because an example of this acronym is my podcast, the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. It's very personal to me because I am the host. My name is in the title. And I talk about whatever I generally find interesting. The podcast is personal to me. It is a discussion-based podcast. And what that means is, discussion-based is, I call it, it's the bar treatment. You sit down with your friends at a bar, or your girlfriend or your significant other, and you just talk. You don't really think about what you're talking about. You just talk, and whatever comes up, comes up. Christian, you can relate to this. You are my co-host on the Talking with Tarashuk podcast, and things, we don't normally have a plan. It's just discussion-based. We just kind of talk and shoot the breeze.
Absolutely. I mean, we have a list of questions. It's unknown, unnamed nonsense segment where we're asking random questions, but oftentimes we'll go off on a tangent.
Yeah.
For 10, 15 minutes, it's like, what, I have a follow-up question, or what do you think about such? What do you think about this? So, yeah.
Yeah, the list of random questions is what we are centered around, right? We are centered around where if we have nothing to talk about, or we kind of get lost, or the topic kind of just runs its course, we're right back to list of questions.
But bottom line, it's the conversation takes precedent over the questions.
Definitely.
Probably.
Definitely.
A good conversation, good topics, that type of thing keeps the ball rolling.
Yeah, like if we just pop in a studio and we start recording and we don't ask a question for 45 minutes, that's a success.
Yeah.
If anything, it's even better.
I mean, at first I was like, oh, we didn't get through that many questions. It's like, well, that means that we were just in a vibe. The chemistry was there, and that's even better.
And the questions are something I completely come up with on my own. For the most part, I encourage people to answer questions.
I've added a few.
Yeah, a few.
Here and there.
And
probably about 10 out of 200, but
if you listen to the podcast, submit your questions. I promise you, I will ask them and I will give you credit. If they're too ridiculous, I just won't ask them. And I reserve that right, because it's a personal podcast. The P stands for personal. But it's also a business podcast, right? The discussion, can focus on anything, albeit sports, medicine, law, entertainment. Because another part of Talking with Tarashuk podcast is I interview people. I have a traditional 101, this is what your typical podcast is, where we sit down either in this studio if they're remote, local, or remote over Zoom and the internet, where, like next week, I have an author on. She is a writer about, she is an English business coach based in Germany. And she just released a book on the World Cup. So I was like, ooh, that's interesting. And if I go, ooh, that's interesting, I go, well, I guess I'm bringing you on my podcast.
And I think that's where it doesn't have to be near perfect acronym here, Will, personally or professionally. But for you, it actually is kind of somewhat of a hybrid.
Exactly.
You have a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's professional interviews of people in topic of interest, industry, or whatever.
Yeah.
And then sometimes it's just us messing around and us talking about what we find interesting.
And you as a listener, you as an audience, you get the choice. You can listen to one, you can listen to both, or you can just go with the clips. A big thing in my podcasting philosophy is, and as a listener, as a host, as a producer, is the most important thing is choice. You have a choice, listen to whatever you want on whatever platform you want. Exclusivity is dead in podcasts. It's going to be a big theme of this series. There's going to be a lot of themes of the series. But yeah, that is the podcast acronym. The most important letters being P and T, because topics can mean whatever you want it to mean. Personal, professional can be whatever you want it to mean. You don't need to follow my advice word for word. A lot of these things in this course also is going to be based on fact. How to edit something on Adobe Audition is a fact. The strengths and weaknesses of this microphone are arguably a fact. But how you structure and format your podcast is not a fact. There is no right or wrong answer. There is no industry standard to tell you what to do and not do. The most successful podcasts are nothing like you would see on traditional media, which is stuff you see on network television, or even Netflix or Hulu or anything else that's out there, or even terrestrial radio like Howard Stern, or like Opie and Anthony, who it used to be, or sports talk radio or radio DJs. There's a specific standard and format they have to follow based off ads and audiences and music. Podcasting is this, like, you can throw all that out the window.
And I'd like to add something.
Please.
Right now, this is a podcast. It's audio and video.
Yeah.
That's another decision that can be made.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you obviously have to be audio capable, but video is a plus. It's a perk. Add some visuals. But it doesn't have to be. So it's all subjective.
It's 1,000% subjective. And that's the point. That's really the point I'm trying to hammer home here. Is that it is all subjective. And you really just can do whatever you want to do. And that's the glory of it. But a podcast is distributed on an RSS feed. So you're going to ask yourself, okay, what is an RSS feed? Never heard that term before. And that's okay, because it really doesn't matter. But it stands for really, really simple syndication. That is what it stands for. And what an RSS feed really is, I'm going to put an overlay of this on here right now. It's right here. This is what it is. It is a long chain of code. That's it. What is your podcast? This is your podcast. It is a long chain of code. Is what your listeners subscribe to. So when they subscribe to you, when you go through your podcast uploader and type in your description, upload your audio, it gets distributed to this code line. And that code gets distributed to all the distribution platforms, such as your individual website, iTunes, Google, Stitcher Podcast, which is my personal favorite for all my Android users out there. Spotify, in the past few years, has exploded with podcasts. But there's also 20 plus others internationally that you can distribute your podcast to for free. There's a big one in Germany. There's a big one in Mexico. There's a big one, I think, in France. Now, do you need to put them out there? No, you don't have to. But why wouldn't you? It's free, and you don't know who's listening. And you also distribute your podcast to social media accounts in clip form. You know, TikTok is exploding. At the end of this series, we have a whole thing on distribution strategies, which we'll get into in depth. And also, other RSS feeds is another place to distribute your audio. Because apparently I am one of the first people to think that you can distribute one piece of audio to multiple RSS feeds. And it's actually a good idea. And with APS, we're going to make sure you can do that from one account, all in one place. And that's huge. Christian, anything to add?
Yeah. Tell them what RSS feed stands for.
Really simple syndication. Yeah, that's it.
And the title itself is simple.
Yeah, it's simple.
Yeah.
It's the most basic form of technology. Like really, like a YouTube channel. It's not technically an RSS feed, but it's similar. So the difference with RSS is that it's mainly for blogs and audio. So originally an RSS feed was mainly just like, your standard blog. You would put a post out and it just goes into the feed and it continues on forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. That's what a podcast, except it adds audio, right? It took 2D from a blog and made it 3D with audio. Now, if you take a YouTube channel, same principle, but it's 4D with video. And you upload it differently, but I bet the code on the back end of YouTube probably looks similar to an RSS feed. I just don't know that for a fact. But yeah, it's very important to distribute it to all different platforms. That's a benefit. So benefits of a podcast. Again, the difference between personal and professional. A podcast is a voice for your brand, personal and professional, or your business. So the number one benefit is you get to connect to your audience, your clients, or your customers. Now, what that means is you have something to say. If you're hosting a podcast, you have something to say. And the audience is also going to have a personal connection to you, whether you know it or not. It could be a thing of love, it could be a thing of hate, or it could be a thing of trust, or in just general information. But the important thing is you're going to connect to your audience. And your audience is just your listeners, regular people like myself and Christian, your clients, or your customers if you're a business. Christian, anything to add?
No, I think you covered that pretty thoroughly.
All right.
Yeah.
You get to provide information around your business. Now, like, say you are a realtor. You should have a podcast because you sell real estate, houses or commercial. Now, you get to provide information around that house. If you are a realtor, technically your agency should have a network account, which can have all the listings of all the houses, but you should also have your individual account where you can have all of your listings and information. So say you are a young couple, newly married, and you're looking for a realtor. You find a realtor, you check out her podcast. It's a video podcast as well. The audio gives you a podcast all about the house information, the square footage of the dining room, the total square footage of the entire lot, how big the backyard is, information about local school districts, how far it is to your local supermarket, what the average neighborhood is like, what other people in the neighborhood are like. This general information. You go to their YouTube channel. You get a virtual tour of the house. You get a video of the front yard, the siding, the backyard, the tree, the tire swing, the picket fence. The dream you are looking for. All that can be provided by a realtor just by creating content. You don't even need to speak to them. You just got to listen to their podcast. And now you as a realtor, that is a huge bonus for you because all you do is send the information over in an email. They do your own research. They like it. You go and show them the house. Done. It's closed. It probably cuts down the time for everything by a lot. I don't know. I've never bought a house.
Yeah.
But also, if you're good, the person who just bought that house, that lovely young couple, they're in their early 30s. They have other friends who are just getting married. Their other friend and their partner are also looking to get married and buy a house. You can go, hey, check out this podcast, this realtor, phenomenal, right? So you're providing information around your business and connecting with your audience or your clients.
Mm-hmm. It's a medium that makes any kind of information much more digestible.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And you get to do it however you want, whatever makes sense to you. If you don't like being on video, just do a regular audio podcast. I think you'd be missing out. But, that's just one example for a realtor. You could do the same thing with a chef who owns a restaurant. You could do the same thing with a lawyer. You just got to be careful with, client confidentiality. But you could also promote a product.
Yeah.
Now, say you're a mechanic, local mechanic in Brooklyn, New York, and you want to start a podcast, but you're a huge car buff. You could do an entire podcast on 1960s, 1970s muscle cars. Every episode, you just highlight a new car.
I was about to say, it is the easiest way to showcase your skill set that is related to the product that you're selling.
Exactly. And then
it's basically a humble brag.
It is. You're showing off. It's the internet, baby. It's social media, Christian.
But you're doing it in a subtle way that you don't come across, that way. You're just, showcasing. So, for example, I own a recording studio.
Mm-hmm.
I could do podcasts on how to record, on audio engineering,
mm-hmm.
on just showing the experiences of the artists, podcasters, the clients that come in here and do what they do. You don't actually have to be, so direct. And that's the beauty of podcasting.
Yeah. And that brings us to the next 2 points: promoting a product and selling a service. If like you, Christian, the Talking with Tarashuk podcast, you being a co-host, you are promoting a podcast and you're also selling a service. But it's in an entertaining way.
To kind of go back to my point, the Talking with Tarashuk podcast, this is a recording studio. There's a lot of artists coming here. It's
mm-hmm.
not exactly jumping out at you as being music related,
mm-hmm.
but it is podcast related, and it's showcasing the capabilities and the services of the studio.
Yeah.
Like, oh, their audio sounds pretty good. Oh, their video looks pretty good. Okay. But am I saying that on the podcast? No.
Yeah.
But the environment and what we're doing and the quality and care that we bring to it speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And just to throw out some ideas or, how that relates back to, sometimes myself doing podcasts. If it's not about a particular topic, related to the business itself.
And you get to demonstrate your expertise.
Exactly.
Like back to the muscle car, right? He's an expert in cars, right? And you run ads in the beginning and end of your show specifically for your auto shop. And you target those ads, around Brooklyn. Yeah, it's an international audience for podcasting, but you can still target it for Brooklyn, right? You put it on the website. It's right there. There's ways to do that. And Jared Laverne will go into in depth on automating your marketing, optimizing your syndication, advertising. It puts more eyes on your business and product, promotional material, discount codes, donation tabs, online stores, drop shipping, merchandise. That's just the tip of the spear, guys.
Well, back in the day, you had to buy ad space,
Yeah.
buy a billboard, shoot a commercial.
Yep.
These are the things you had to do. If we're talking, relating to promoting a product, it's not cheap. Try to get a billboard in New York City.
Yeah, Christian, one of the questions on the Talk My Tarashuk podcast is how much you think a New York Times billboard is.
That's exactly what made me think of it.
Yeah, so we haven't asked that yet, but that's the first guess game, so I have no idea how much it costs, but it's going to be fun when we actually ask that question.
Interesting enough, a friend of mine had a billboard, and just to kind of give us an idea of how expensive it is, not an actual number, he only had it up for a couple hours.
Oh, my God.
Probably, 8 hours out of the day.
It's probably thousands of dollars.
Probably.
I
mean, we're talking Times Square.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I picked like the central hub.
I mean, because you got to pick a good time.
Yeah.
I mean, but is there a bad time in New York City, the city that never sleeps?
Yeah, definitely.
There still is a less optimal time. But yeah,
we'll get there.
That's what you used to have to do. And a podcast is something that you can do yourself.
Yeah, at a fraction of the cost.
At a fraction of the cost.
At a fraction of the cost.
That's the point.
To a wider audience.
Exactly.
International, as in the entire world. And it lives forever.
Yeah.
So like there's podcasts I listen to right now, Christian, where in the pandemic I got really behind. Believe it or not, I got behind my podcast listening. And it was a wrestling podcast, and it was released in August of 2020. And I listened to it the other day. And the ads are still on that podcast. And as long as those discount codes and those promo codes are still active and that partnership still exists, I could still get that discount 2 years later.
Yeah.
Tell me another form of advertising.
From a podcast.
From a podcast. An audio-only podcast. Their video is kind of poopy. But an audio-only podcast. That ad lives forever. And you never know when people are going to go back and listen to something.
And, but you're looking at it from the consumer side. From their side, there's still an existing opportunity for new business.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you want to go to the personal side, another benefit of a podcast is you entertain your audience. It's fun. This podcast right now, I was kind of like not scared to do it, but I was kind of like, how do I do this? Now I'm doing it, having a ball. It's a lot of fun.
We're doing it
because we kind of have to. We want a business. But it's also a creative outlet. I have gotten great benefit from this year with Talk My Tarashuk because it let me explore my creative outlets. All the graphics you've been seeing and will see on this podcast is done by me. All the editing is 100% done by me. Anything you see on the posting on YouTube and the scheduling on social media, that's 100% all done by me, which sucks, but someone's got to do it. But it's still a creative outlet. I like kind of exploring how to use Adobe After Effects and creating these new graphics because it's a skill. It's a muscle. It's something I get to work out. And I have gotten a lot better. And that transfers over to my professional work. It transfers over everything. So that creative outlet is incredible. And you get to expand your network. That's one of the final ones.
Right. Build upon social skills. Although it takes a certain level of social ability to be able to hold a conversation, ask interesting things, have interesting feedback, all of it.
And you meet interesting people. That's why I do like having guests.
I've seen some of the people you've interviewed, and it's just like, wow, he's talking to this guy now.
Yeah. Shout out to Jill Malandrino. She was the best.
Yeah.
Not saying that because she's also one of my bosses, but also because she's one of my bosses. But yeah, you get to expand your network. From that podcast with Jill, I got 2 more people from my podcast who, one, I never thought would ever be a guest on my podcast, and that was actually her former boss by the name of Alan, friend of the show, Alan. And we talked about, the corporate structure of America, how to be a successful business owner. And after that podcast, I asked him some one-on-one advice because it's, again, networking, building your network, ladies and gentlemen. He gave me some phenomenal advice that, may not have been effective at that moment since what we were trying to do almost fell through. But in the future, I'm going to remember that advice. So thank you to Alan for doing that. Alan, if you listen to that, you're the man. But expand your network. I've talked to plenty of people, interesting people, because I kept my ideas open. I don't need the Talking to Tarashuk podcast to be fixated on one topic. That's why it's centered around select topics, plural. because I can do it however I want. And it's accessible. Most people listen to podcasts on their phone when they're on the go, on the work commute. Again, cooking, cleaning, gaming, showering, trying to sleep, etc. So a benefit to the podcast is you don't need to be at the TV at 8 o'clock like it's a football game, or you don't need to be there at Monday night at 8 o'clock or Sunday night at 10 o'clock to watch new Game of Thrones. Right? It's not appointments. It's accessible. You can do it whenever you want. You can be like me. Let's do the podcast 2 years later. It's still there. And guess what? It's still entertaining. You're in full control. So that's one thing that relates as a podcaster. You are in full control, but you also have no control. Because you're in full control of what you do and how you do it, but you're in no control in how it's received or when it's consumed. So
it's a shot in the dark.
Yeah.
But at the same time, as your point with the control aspect of everything, it's very empowering.
It is.
You know, being behind the microphone or potentially the camera, and it establishes you as an expert. In this day and age of social media, there's a weird thing that happens when you get behind the mic and when you get behind the camera. You could be saying complete nonsense, but because you went the distance and you put the effort in to get behind the microphone or get behind the camera, it's believable.
It's freedom.
It's it's creative freedom.
It's so freedom.
And
that's the last part,
for a lot of people, seeing is believing, and I'll add and or hearing to that sentiment.
I mean, Christian, you're new to podcasting, right? I think was I the first one you did? Or actually, we're on for this episode, this podcast.
I did a couple podcasts.
You did a few with Jared.
Yeah. Nothing that aired, but kind of got my feet wet, so to speak.
Yeah,
but
Jared
it definitely wasn't the real deal with us doing podcasts day in, day out, audio going, video on, at times having virtual guests, people physically in the studio. Definitely a different animal. But I found my voice. It took probably I don't know how many episodes we've done at this point.
Probably a dozen.
Yeah,
you
probably
and me.
a dozen.
Probably
Yeah, first two I had to figure it out.
Yeah, I kind of.
It's like I'm a very social guy, but it's different once the camera is there, or that's really the aspect for me.
I just remember your first dozen podcasts or so, if not the first year, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be really bad.
Depending on who you are. Maybe you have a knack.
Maybe. I mean, not everyone's like me, who's just a natural at it.
Yeah,
but I can listen to my first 10 podcasts. I hate them. They're out there, except the first one. The first one's not out there, which is ironic. The first podcast I ever did is in public. I lost a file, and I'm glad because it was awful. But you
gotta find your voice. You gotta find your sometimes there isn't that much of a difference between your persona and what you're putting out there.
Yeah,
sometimes it's you will yourself. You come alive.
I do.
You come alive.
I do.
But it is you. It's a part of you.
Yeah. You totally can't tell I ate Burger King before I got here.
Oh, absolutely. This guy's always on fire.
I was just like, down in the dumps. But now, I don't know what it is, man.
Once
I don't know what it is.
Once it starts rolling, you're in the zone.
You can't teach that either. Like if
that's who you are, then you should definitely do a podcast.
Yeah, if you're coming to this series to try and find your voice from me, I can't help you. You can find your voice. But
path of self-discovery.
The free expression part of podcasting is the biggest and most important one. Podcasting isn't regulated, kind of, yet. I mean, it's self-regulation for the most part, but the TV has the FCC.
Yeah, as long as you're not doing anything criminal.
Yeah, as long as you're not doing anything criminal. But even that,
I mean, you could have a podcast with you just saying curse words in different languages. There was a time you couldn't even say curse words on TV.
Yeah, but you can say whatever word you want on a podcast.
Whatever you want.
Whatever you want.
It could be you could be saying horrible things. It does. And that's the thing. I'm not promoting saying horrible things, but I'm just saying you can do the world is your oyster.
Yeah, I really do consider it one of podcasting. That is one of the most
putting the camera on you for this one.
It's one of the most purest forms of communication. And I do think it's one of the last bastions of free speech.
No censorship.
Yet.
Yeah. You think it's...
I mean, anything's possible. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball here. But it's still early enough for you to be grandfathered in, I think. But
I think
Because like, who would they go after? Who would they go after? By they, I don't even know who they is. Who is they, and who would they go after? iTunes? All right, you take it off iTunes, on Spotify, and 20 different other places.
Right. It's
You
not.
go after the hosting platform.
There's
what?
really no central nervous system.
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like blockchain.
Kind of.
But I will say this to people that are thinking about doing a podcast: if you're thinking about it, do it. There are people that got in early on social media, got in early on TikTok, got in early on platforms like Instagram, and they're huge now. When everyone else was kind of tiptoeing the line and thinking about doing it, and maybe didn't go for it, now a lot of those people are wildly successful. So that's another thing.
Yeah. So that's
get in it before it's saturated. I don't think it's saturated at this point.
I don't think it's ever gonna be saturated. I don't, because I think it's the future. Because look at traditional media, and by traditional I mean cable news, broadcast media, the cable TV model. The idea of ratings is completely changing. The model of what it means to have successful content is completely changing day by day, year by year. So I don't think it's ever going to get oversaturated. It is, however, going to be harder to make it to the top, but I do think it's going to be more of the best will make it, and not necessarily who has the most money and who is in the most control.
Right.
Now let's leave that at that. Because I don't want to get political and silly on this podcast. We're on the fundamentals to get started. So we have beaten you to death on why podcasts are awesome, and we've defined what they are. So you're like, great, Will, stop talking. Tell me how I can get started. Give me that A to Z roadmap. So the first thing you got to do is figure out, is your podcast going to be personal, professional, or a hybrid? That's the first thing. What do I want to do? And you can make money and be successful with all of them. But really the difference, honestly, is how much money you put into it and how much money you should put into it. If it's personal, you probably don't need to put in that much, honestly. You can do it on a shoestring budget. If you're a business and you want to be professional, you're going to have to put a decent amount of money in it, and it's going to pay off. But after you got that figured out, an idea for a show. What is your podcast going to be about? Are you going to be like a true crime podcast, like a My Favorite Murder? Are you going to be a finance podcast, like something the New York Times does? Are you going to be a interview podcast like Joe Rogan does? Are you going to be a wrestling podcast like Kings of Rings podcast? Are you going to be a Talking with Tarashuk podcast, which is a variety show? It's a mixed bag, but it's a podcast. So figure that out. Who is your audience? Who are you targeting? Who do you want to listen to your podcast? That's something I kind of wish I figured out a while ago, because I didn't really know. I just kind of want to throw it out there and see what happens. Is your podcast going to be a hobby where you just kind of do it periodically and it's fun and you build a little community, you got a Discord server and it's, you meet some cool people? Or is it a tool for your business? Are you that realtor? Are you that mechanic? Are you that chef? Are you that life insurance person? Because even if you're selling life insurance, right? This because you're selling life insurance doesn't mean your podcast has to be about life insurance. You could be a giant baseball fan and hate the Yankees. You could do a podcast saying how much you wish the Yankees would die and they wish they bought your life insurance. There you go. What kind of show is it? I can't believe I made that connection together, Christian. You believe that? What kind of show is it? I swear, guys, this isn't scripted at all. What kind of show is it? Is it an interview show? Right? Do you want to do one-on-one interviews like I do? Or like Rogan does? Or like most people do? It's probably the second easiest kind of podcast to do, because you sit down, you ask people questions. Cool. It's fun. If you do an interview show, is it going to be in person? Is it going to be remote? If you do it in person, what's that going to look like? Are you going to want to be in a studio and ante up all that cash? Or are you going to be like, listen, we can do it in my garage. Might be a little echoey, or we can do it in my basement, which is it's on the ground. It's a little better for sound. Again, personal, professional. Personal's going to have one alley. Professional's going to be another alley. Or are you going to do it remotely? Are you going to do it on Zoom? You could do it on Zoom.
And both lanes are viable.
Both lanes are totally viable. Right? Like I said, we're getting into equipment, I think, in the next few episodes. And there's going to be plenty of options for what you want to do professionally or personally. So we'll get into that in detail later. Is your podcast going to be a narrative? Is it going to be story-driven? Those are more rare, but those are definitely the future. like Christian, you have a client in here doing an audiobook.
Yes. And she actually brought up, I forgot, they're not calling them podcasts, but essentially it's a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Like true crime
Mm-hmm.
stories where there's a story being told, like watching the Crime Channel kind of thing,
Mhm.
but just audio.
What's the difference?
And there's sound effects,
Mhm.
it's kind of like a movie without the visuals.
Exactly. What's the difference between a audiobook and a podcast?
It's read from a novel.
Mm-mm.
That you're saying is something
Put that
else?
camera on me. That the difference between an audiobook and a podcast is the paywall. That's it. That's it. Maybe ads. It's just how you make money. The difference between an audiobook and a podcast is how you make money.
You're saying that it's that audiobooks are monetized.
Yeah, it's behind a paywall. It's on a Kindle. What's the
Audible.
Audible. Right? You sell it, right? It's kind of like a publisher, but how do you publish an audiobook? Well, you kind of got to go to a recording studio and just publish it.
Well, you go to a recording studio, you record it, and then you
put it out there.
You put it out there, and there's a price with it. You have to.
Exactly.
I think you have to be a publisher to do that. But yeah.
Yeah. What a podcast? They're free.
They're free.
They're free. And a narrative podcast is essentially it's an audiobook. There's the sound effects, there's music. You can hire voice actors, right? It still fits the theme of a podcast. You can make it free and throw ads in and do all the same marketing you would do. You could put it on an RSS feed and get the benefits of an RSS feed over a publisher, right? You can totally do that. Narrative-based podcasts.
There's no middleman.
There is no middleman. No. It's all you, baby. It's all you. Good luck.
I heard a hit on Austin Powers there.
Yeah. Baby. I love them like baby. I do it all the time. Is your podcast discussion based? It's two dudes sitting in a room talking. Not really scripted. The questions are there for guidelines more than anything. That's how I do my podcasts. Discussion based is more of my friends and family. Like Rick, when I had my cousin Michael in, or my other cousin Christopher, or my friend Zach, or my friend Ricky. Yeah, we had the questions, kind of have a gimmick, but it's discussion based. We just kind of sit down and talk like I've known them for years, because I have known them for years. I don't need a plot, an outline, right? Is your podcast going to be business or product based? Your podcast could be all about skincare and your skincare routines because you're selling a skincare product. There you go, podcast. Is it a one-time goal? Meaning it has a beginning and an end. That can be an audiobook. That can be, once that house sells, you take down the podcast because it's already sold. You can leave, you could leave it up, but you could just you could just edit the title, be sold. If they won't go back and listen to it, they could listen to it. They really want to.
I mean, there are entire shows based off houses, being sold.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, this house was sold. People go, oh, well, why was it sold? And they tell you about all the beautiful things about the house, what the person was looking for. It's limitless.
It is. But yeah, like a one-time goal podcast is it has a beginning, it has an end. It could be one episode.
And we like that.
Yeah.
As people, we like that.
Yeah.
We like to have that closure, beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah. It's storytelling. Storytelling 101. But even like this podcast series is a one-time podcast. It's going to be 10 to 15 episodes, maybe a little more. And after that, it's done. It's going to have video accompanying it, but once it's done, it's done. Never doing it again, I promise. But the main thing, again, is it personal or is it professional? That's one of the most important things you got to figure out for your podcast. Because it's personal, you can cut corners, not cut corners, but financially cut corners and prep cut corners. Professional, if you don't go all the way, you're not going to go anywhere. Another thing to consider, what personal experiences or professional experiences do you have that can add value? And what makes it personal to you? Because if you're talking about something you don't care about, it's going to come across, it's going to be obvious, and it's going to be fucking terrible. I put one F word in there.
Yeah, I was wondering if we were doing that.
Yeah, well, I just put one for emphasis. Sorry, everybody. And then other than that, you got to figure out who's going to host. We have a co-host. Will you have guests? All that kind of stuff, which we will go in depth in later episodes. This is an introductory course. It's probably going about 40 minutes, so enjoy the clips, or thank you for making it this far. This course will cover. We can wrap it up and go home. Show name. How to pick a name. The do's and don'ts of a name. logo, the do's and don'ts of a logo, color scheme, fonts, and everything else. And the quality specifications for a logo, because iTunes has a very specific standards for their podcast logo, meaning like the bit rate, the size, the type of file it is, stuff like that. We're going to cover that in all detail. All the equipment you're going to need: microphones, mixers or interfaces, headphones, recording and editing software. So we're going to cover hardware and software. Most, if not all of it, you can buy at the APS shop. We're going to do video tutorials of how to set everything up. So Christian, me and you're going to have a lot of fun in this studio setting up this equipment really slowly with a camera, recording it.
Yeah.
So that's going to be fun. Editing software. I'm a big fan of Adobe Audition. Christian, the man behind the board, is a big fan of Pro Tools. You know, there's free softwares out there like Audacity. We're going to go over the pros and cons of all of those. How to set up your equipment and record your first episode. We're going to show you how to record. Literally, I'm going to have a screen recording of me hitting the record button so you can see what it looks like, and stopping the recording so you can see what it looks like. How to edit on a multi-track. All that's going to be there. How to distribute your podcast on an RSS feed, and how to best use social channels. All that will be here in this podcast intro course. That's going to be released everywhere. It's going to be released on Talking to Tarashuk feed. It's going to be released on APS feeds. It's going to be released on Christian's feeds. This is going to be released in as many places as possible. Because when it comes to podcasting, a big philosophy I have is that everything needs to be everywhere. Always. And that is very important. And I'm going to explain what all that means next time. Christian, any final thoughts?
No, I think we did a good job introducing it, giving the who, what, when, where, why of it all. And, you know, going forward, this was just an introduction. We're going to get into the more technical aspects of it and actually delve into the topics.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think let's wrap it up.
And this is everything we do as a podcast company, Ambiguous Podcast Solutions. You know, Christian doesn't just let me use his studio. He is a partner and a big important part of this company that was started in 2019, and here we are 3 years later, kind of still dotting our I's and crossing our T's. But Christian, I'm very glad to have you here with me.
Happy to be here, man.
All right, and if you want to have any services done for you, we can handle all of them. Head over to ambiguouspodcastsolutions.com and reach out to us. We handle everything. All the editing can be done once our app is ready. I think by the time this is released or close to it, the app will be ready. We can distribute a podcast to all 20-plus platforms worldwide, distributing on multiple podcast feeds, which is very, very important. My name is Will Tarashuk. If you want to reach me, you can have any questions to add for the Talk with Tarashuk podcast. You want to be a guest on any one of my podcasts, you want to talk to me and say my hair looks great or my beard needs to be trimmed, one or the other. That's Will at apspodcast.com. It's WILL at apspodcast.com. And I'd love to talk to you. It'll be a great time. Christian, all your plugs, my friend.
Cube Recording Studios. As you can see, we're in Cube Recording Studios in Montclair, New Jersey right now. This podcast has been recorded here. The video has been recorded here, engineered by myself or another engineer of choice. And if you need any services, anything audio, anything video, we can handle it. CubeRecordingStudios.com or APS, AmbiguousPodcastSolutions.com.
All right. Enjoy the rest of this course. Enjoy making your podcasts, and send me a link once it's there. I will listen to it. I will subscribe to it, and I will check it out. But until then, y'all take care.